as Abby mentioned, one of the things that we focus on when investing in companies is their growth trajectory and how will they make money and grow to be very big businesses so that the investment we make in them justifies the ultimate goal of getting a very big return for the founders and me as a VC for my investors and my fund. And one of the often undervalued topics when folks start thinking about starting businesses is the thinking around the business model, the monetization plan, whether you're an enterprise-focused company or a consumer-oriented company. And in part, I think that's a little bit of a function of the times during, markets that are strong. Oh, everyone will make it, just build it, and somehow they will miraculously come. In part because there have been so many interesting, large, consumer-oriented companies where the monetization path has been determined much, much later in the life cycle. I mean, you can think of Twitter. For 7 years of their existence, they didn't have a business model. Some would argue that they're still innovating and figuring out their monetization. Not to say that they're not successful by any stretch of imagination, quite the contrary. But the fact of the matter is that that legacy of drive adoption has affected other areas. So oftentimes entrepreneurs tend to undermine or not think through fully the consequences of having or not having determined the business plan up front from a monetization path. With that in mind, I had the option of doing the slides and lecturing, and I'm an HBS alum, and that's not what we did. At least at HBS, we talked about things and we started sentences with building on. So my approach here will be different. I think Abby has been kind enough to identify 2 companies, 2 startups that are trying to figure their monetization model and business model. So what we will do is we'll have a chat, and I will play my daily job, which is ask a bunch of questions as if I was considering them for funding, which is not part of this workshop, but at least you get some exposure to my mindset and as a VC. And then also, secondly, though, see how I will probe, and the sole focus is going to be about business model, how you monetize, how you scale, et cetera, et cetera. And then I will open it up to you so we can talk about the differences on building a consumer business versus an enterprise business, and then within those, what are, on the enterprise side, licensing versus a SaaS model and how those 2 play out, or on the consumer side, freemium versus ad-supported versus other paths. Does it sound like a plan? Lovely. Who's going to be the first victim? Alex? By the way, can you guys see? Okay, good. So why don't we start by you're telling everyone so we can catch everyone up on who you are and the elevator pitch on your business.
Definitely. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Wirth, and I am a senior at the college. I am the co-founder of Quorum, and we are developing a legislative strategy platform that does big data analysis of the U.S. Congress for government relations professionals. So we are very much a B2B SaaS business, and that we've developed a piece of software and are now selling it to government relations professionals in Washington. And the big thing that we're trying to figure out is how do you develop a pricing structure around the software and assign both a specific value to the software and then figure out how you get people to buy not only one subscription, but then also scale it and buy multiple subscriptions. And do you have an entry-level price? Do you have one price and have that for all users? Do you offer discounts as you sell more and more? But starting to figure out that process in the B2B sales cycle.
Lovely. So let's talk a little bit about the value prop and to whom. So what problem are you solving and for whom?
So we're basically helping government relations professionals better understand Congress. Right now, you have 535 members of Congress, over 36,000 bills over the last 6 years, 10,000 votes. It's a lot of information to keep track of. And what we're doing is using big data and algorithms to sort through that to provide information like what are the top issues member of Congress work on, who do they most frequently work with, as well as a suite of productivity and legislative tracking tools that help them better keep track of what they're doing on the day-to-day lives, which saves them time.
So to better tackle the issue of who's willing to pay how much and how do you scale from there to get them to buy more products, you use the term government relations. I will do what I would normally do. So, and even though I'm going on record, I say, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Like, who is this person really? Is it a lobbyist? Is it a non-for-profit pro-executive director that's doing it out of passion? Two very different wealth profiles there, or some other third party.
Definitely. So we're kind of lumping it all together. Government relations is Washington's new word for lobbyists. But in terms of our specific market, it is one, the lobbyists, two, corporate managers and the folks that oversee and hire the lobbyists that might not have as much experience with Washington. And then the third is the nonprofit professionals that are really trying with limited resources to do it. Although the cohort of our market right now that we're focusing on is the lobbyists because they have the most money and also are an incredible amount of need because they're so stressed for time.
And so then what does your typical lobbyist organization look like? How many people? How many touch points with Congress? How many? I'm assuming they're not all calling the congressman or the senator. They're calling the aide. They're calling. So, tell me again if there is a. I will consider one lobbying firm for the purposes of this discussion as one entity, as one enterprise that you sell into. How many touch points are there, and how many of those folks would need to have access to this data?
So it gets a little bit complicated because you've got different sizes of lobbying firms, and that you've got your smaller shops, which are doing about $2 million a year in revenue, less than 10 people, mid-sized firms with between 20 to 30 folks doing $5 to $6 million in revenue, and then a series of massive firms. We were talking 100 to 150 people solely doing government relations work that are bringing in anywhere between 15 and $25 million of revenue.
And is there an 80-20 rule? So if you focus purely on the large ones that are bringing 15 to 20 plus million, is that 80% of the market?
It's probably less. It's probably more like 20% of the market in terms of potential users.
Okay.
The bigger market is the smaller firms because you get a lot of people going out and starting their own firms.
And is there a follower leader mentality? So if the top 20 guys or a subset of the 20% adopts you, all the rest of the market follows you, or is there such behavior at all? What's the market dynamic?
So we're still figuring that out. Our sense is there is, just because once people feel like that they need this information, and we're providing a whole level of information that's never been provided before, is they don't want to be left out, and they're going to feel like they have to actually, purchase the software so they have access to this because they need this information. And that's also where too, people look to the bigger firms in town who everybody knows, Podesta Group, Aiken Gump, Holland and Knight, and say, oh, these are the really big lobbying firms. If they're using it, there must be something here. So our assumption is yes, there is a follower mentality.
Hence, does that mean that your go-to-market to get the first proof points to start testing, and we'll get even more concrete around the monetization model, but does that mean for you that you're doing a double or two-pronged strategy, trying to get one of the big guys to adopt you, an early adopter, but also trendsetter, and then some of the other middle or smaller guys for validation, or how are you going to tackle it?
Exactly like that. So, we're entirely going right now just through folks that we know of getting initial beta testers. One of the things we've struggled a little bit with is how do you approach the big firms who, could easily buy one subscription to the platform, and we're pricing it at $4,800 a year. But how do you get them to buy multiple subscriptions, and how many of the big firms should you go to before we're entirely certain of the pricing model and how to scale it? Because, we don't want them to pay $4,800 a year when they could be paying, to buy a subscription for every single person at the firm. And so figuring that out, but yes, very much, we would love to get a series of the big firms together to then be able to target, the smaller firms as well and have that validated.
Okay, so let's talk actually about the product itself, and then ultimately we get to the pricing. The product itself, oftentimes in the startup world, even though there's a lot of disruption and innovation, we think about analogies, and they're a good way to convey your business, even though they're not a good way to define your business, but to convey your business and also to not reinvent the pieces that don't need to be reinvented. So when you think about your business, is it, here I go, the LexisNexis for the Congress or for lobbying? Is it Reuters? Is it Bloomberg for that vertical? What is it?
So a very simple analogy to put it is exactly as the Bloomberg terminal did for Wall Street in bringing a whole series of quantitative information and analysis. We're doing a similar thing to Washington of instead of just putting the qualitative reporting out there, actually bringing the quantitative numbers of saying, how many bills did a member work on an X specific issue area, or how many percentage of their bills actually got out of committee. And that's information that you can tabulate by hand right now, but that nobody's done. And so it is going to be a bit of a shift, just like Bloomberg's introduction to Wall Street was, in terms of really narrowing in and having all that information at your fingertips.
But what that does, for the purposes of this discussion, now that he's framing, it's taking an existing business model and applying it to a new vertical, so to speak. So all of a sudden, we all have a frame of mind as to, okay, this has been done before. The willingness to pay, we have yet not determined. It is not when Bloomberg machines first came to market, they cost $30,000 a machine, right? Today, hardware is much more commoditized, and the software piece and the data piece, that's where the value lies in. But at least we have now framed okay, we have some data points or existing business models for other verticals that we can turn around and apply. We will have to modify them to address this market, but we have something to work with. So then the question is the software piece replacing manual labor? Is there an assistant in these firms or an entry-level person or an intern that is informally trying to collect this data?
Some specific parts of it. So there's specific things that people look at that are being manually collected right now. Or, for example, a really simple one is building a legislative scorecard. So the AARP, the Sierra Club, the NRA, all has their legislative scorecards. My members an A through an F. And what they do is they sit there and actually hand score every single vote. And we can do that with a computer in about 30 seconds. And so that is where it is replacing the manual labor, and the assistants and the legislative assistants at these firms, see it as a huge time saver because that's what they're doing on a daily basis.
So right there and then you could make the argument not only does this drive revenue for the firm, but also it's a cost-saving piece. So if you assume that the average assistant is $40,000 to $50,000, and again, I could be wrong, it may be $60,000, whatever that price point is, right there and then, and you've said only part of it, so you can make some determination, but you can see that you can just replace that function, charge the same amount, and deliver the product in 5 seconds or whatever the amount of time is. That's another data point to start thinking about pricing. So then let's talk about, do you charge per module, or do you charge per subscription or per seat, as the term used to be? Because you did use the term SaaS. Mm-hmm. And SaaS has become very, very sexy these days. I have 2/3 of my companies that are focused on enterprise that have approached the choice of licensing versus a SaaS model and have gone with the latter. It is a model that folks need to understand well because it's very capital intensive. So while it's beautiful, you charge up front, you collect up front, it's recurring, you get the customers once, you retain them over time. Next year, you don't have to worry about that first $2 million that you did this year because it's just gonna repeat itself. You just have to build on top of that. It has all those appealing factors. It also requires a lot of investment up front. CFOs in a lot of companies are wisening up and saying, wait a minute, it used to be that I would have to pay a license for the software and I'll pay it over 12 months or I'll pay it 90 days late, and I still do 90 days late, but way out there. Today, I have 10 vendors, all of which are SaaS players, all of which are asking me to pay it up front. Why in the world would I do that? And then with SaaS models, you reach profitability, but then to grow, you have to invest. So you dip down and go cash flow negative. Then you reach profitability, then you go. So it's an S curve. You're still moving that direction, but it's dipping and up and dipping and up. So it's not just, it's a beautiful business model, but it's one that requires understanding. And on average, at least for venture-backed companies, it's a model that requires over the time of a business. And again, there's never this is how it's always done. But generally, and in all of my statements, there's a disclaimer, there's always exceptions. But generally, it requires $20 to $30 million. And Inside Ventures, which is a later stage growth fund, has published quite a bit of work around SaaS, if you folks are interested in that. Back to you. So on that piece, though, you have some data points. Are you thinking about having 3, 4, 2, I don't know, modules in the product and charging for that horizontally? If you want the full platform, you get a discount. If not, you get these pieces at these a la carte prices that could be subscription. Or you get everything, but it's on a per seat or per sign-on point of view, or a combination of the two, if you can think of it as a matrix.
So we've been working to figure that out. Our current thought right now is doing it per seat, partially because we want to say, look, we're going to provide every tool that you need, and we're not going to sit here and hold tools from you that can save you lots of time. We've also heard from folks that in terms of buying other software, it's like kind of buying a car, and that you can add this on, you can add that on, and are a little concerned that might delay the sales cycle to a point where you're sitting there going back and forth about adding features and discounts, and so we're not opposed to kind of segmenting the product and providing different features, but have taken the approach right now of doing it at a per seat basis and saying, you get everything that we have at that one price.
So here's some things to consider, and that's perfectly valid. I think some things to consider on a per seat basis is realistically how many folks will actually be utilizing this. Will the top lobbyist or the CEO of the firm touch it? Probably not. Someone will hand him or her a piece of paper, but will so-and-so. Try to map out how many individuals, and then when are you going to call it an enterprise license, enterprise-wide license? So it may be that I'm going to make stuff up to 5 seats is individuals, or it's, you have 2 seats as a bundle, 5 seats, and then an enterprise-wide license, unlimited. And if you're charging, I'll round the numbers out so I avoid demonstrating that I cannot do arithmetic. Let's say for 2 seats you do 5,000, for 5 seats volume discount you do 10,000, and for enterprise-wide you do 30,000. If that's the case, that's what you go to that's what you go to market with. And then I think you will have some channel conflict, because on the one hand, to drive adoption, you're going to need the non-for-profits or that are not as wealthy as the lobbyists with all the corporate backing, which are basically entities that need the tool but can't afford the tool. So the way we see that in the market, and the reason why, first of all, you have to ask the question, do I want their business? And there are plenty of instances when you say, no, thank you. But oftentimes you say yes, from the point of view of driving adoption and awareness in the market, of not leaving money on the table if you can have it, and also for getting your algorithms and your software trained in the case of if you're also taking inputs and data from them, or also just on the delivery of the content itself. So there is value. But if you go with that, be very careful about cannibalizing your markets, because how are you going to deal with these guys who can't afford it? One approach is to offer a light version of your product so that you're disabling certain functionality and offering it at a lower price. But again, be very careful when you do that, because you don't want the big guys to start buying that product. That is not your goal. Does that make sense? May I open it up to you folks for questions? Because I've been talking, or you for me? Oh, come on. Please.
Can you give me a better idea of the different size lobbying groups? What are they doing now to kind of fill this void that you have? You said that there's some degree of manual tallying, but I mean, how does this go beyond what they're doing right now? What are they doing now, and then what you're offering, how does it go beyond what they're doing?
Let me repeat the question I'm assuming for your recording. So the question is, what market pain point are you truly solving, and how exactly are you solving it? What is your product? Is that correct? Yeah.
So right now, it really depends on the firm. For the smaller firms, a lot of it is you've worked on the Hill, so you just know what's going on, and you read Playbook every morning, and you read the Washington Post, and you know which members might be good and which members might not be good on it. So for those people, it is introducing a new kind of way of saying, all right, let's give you another different profile of members that's more comprehensive, that has got all these specific metrics to it. And then for the bigger firms, they're the ones that are actually keeping track of the different vote scores and the different tallies. and they're doing that all by hand right now. And so, especially in trying to keep track of 535 members, they're going to every member's website every morning and checking, are there new press releases, are there new bills that this member is doing? They're walking around the hill trying to catch up on what's going on. And so what we're doing is simply putting that all at their fingertips of saying, we'll scrape it straight from the Library of Congress and then put it on the platform so you don't have to go trying to find it, and you can be aware of all the information all at one point.
And presumably, you're pitching it as an understanding of what's going on in Congress, but I think as I listen to you talk, you could have a whole other area to pitch to these firms around getting business from corporations, and this could be part of their marketing materials because they're now aware that, hey, so-and-so congressman has supported this many bills for or against, I don't know, pick a topic, and done that, and becomes part of their pitch to be driving revenue, which is why I find this tool interesting, because oftentimes when you're selling, you ask yourself, what am I selling and what problem am I solving? Is it a nice to have tool? Is it a very nice to have, but they can still live without it? Or is it a must have? And the closer you are on the must have scale, the more you can charge for it clearly. The other thing that I touched a little bit about on the SaaS topic, but the other thing to consider with SaaS businesses is retention/churn and customer acquisition cost and lifetime value of the customer. So I just threw a bunch of terms. Again, I said the beauty of SaaS businesses is the repeatability of the subscription, and then oftentimes the successful collection upfront of cash if you are very good at managing that, and that's a really important and key factor, the ability to collect in a timely fashion, because your customers become your financing tool in that regard. But it also presumes that you are able to have very high retention rates, 90% plus. Otherwise, you're undermining the value of having a subscription business. An early focus on churn, or the reverse of it, retention, is really, really important. And then once you start having enough data points, I don't know exactly how far along you are in your sales process, the ability to track the lifetime value of your customer over the customer acquisition cost, the CAC ratio. How quickly do you recover? What did you spend? What's your marketing, sales, per customer to acquire that one additional customer, so on the margin? And how much money are you extracting from a revenue point of view from that customer? If any of you were considering venture funding, we often, as a sort of, although I think there are plenty of other people out there, I often look for a rule of thumb of about 5x coverage. I have one company that's 21x. They're totally an outlier, and they're the joy of my heart. But 5x or above, we're looking good. You're looking good, and all of a sudden you're interesting. There's something, because what it means is, it's not an arbitrary number. What it means is that there is enough business that's being generated to justify your existence, and you can probably scale from there. So that's another metric. SaaS businesses are very, very metrics oriented, and unlike other businesses where sometimes you can't measure concretely, here it's all about execution and tracking and tweaking as appropriate.
Do you have any other metrics that you'd recommend looking at in addition to that of tracking?
So for your business, so yeah, I would look at, starting from the top, I would look at bookings, billings, and revenue. Bookings, basically sales. How, you sign the contract, and you're calling that a booking. And I would look, if you have multi-year contracts, I'd also look at 12-month booking or annual bookings versus the total value of the booking. Because if you 1 year get a 3-year contract, and let's say the 3-year contract is $3 million, and so it looks great, and the next year you get 3 customers at $1 million, so it's also $3 million. It's not exactly the same thing, because what you've gotten is 1 customer with a big check. Next year, those guys will not pay you anything else. You'll recognize the revenue because of GAAP, but that booking is cold. It's much better to be getting more customers that you can grow than just one customer. And you want to be able to to draw that distinction. Or let me say differently, you have one customer that has that is bringing $3 million this 1 year, and next year you have 5 customers at $1 million. If you can get big customers because it's one effort, but you also have dependencies. But to be able to draw a distinction between those is very, very important. So you look at it as an annual contract value, and you look at it as total bookings. If in fact your contract value is more than 12 months, or your deals are more than 12 months in duration, so that's bookings. Billings is your ability to collect cash. So you build. So that's actually the difference between the two. The third piece is revenue, and that's just GAAP. When have you earned and realized, for those of you who have some sort of accounting background, so the ability to recognize your revenue, otherwise it's deferred. Those are 3 just given. The lifetime value calculation, the lifetime value over CAC, so implicit in there is the CAC calculation, churn, retention, average price point, but you look at that, I hope to God, in any way, in any business. And then I think the ability to upsell and renewals. So because again, you may, and renewals both in terms of the percent change of the number of customers and in dollar value, because you may say year over year we got, from a dollar point of view, 100% renewals. But if you look at the customers, let's assume you have 10, you might have lost all 9. It's just that the 10th guy that stayed with you overspent so much that that company made up for the other 9. So you got to get granular, and that's why you look at upsells as a separate line, and then renewals both on a dollar perspective and from a customer perspective. I hope I'm explaining this, but go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned before the 20 to 30 million as a general rule.
Yeah, and again, I'm sure there will be plenty of exceptions to that, but yeah, that's...
Yeah, I'm just curious how that breaks down. Maybe this is a hard question to answer, but how that breaks down in terms of, is that sales staff? Is it account executives to support your clients? Is it marketing dollars? Do you have a general sense for how that kind of breaks down?
So, by the way, the 20 to 30 million is the capital that goes in outside capital that goes in typically over the life of the business. And it is really, really hard even that statement is so generalized that I'm sure people can drive trucks through it. But in the early days, it's probably so if there is a seed round of $1 million, $1.5 million, which once upon a time we used to call a Series A, but in the seed round, you're probably just working on proof of concept, getting the beta of the product and getting that going. With your Series A financing, you're probably really advancing, and it depends. Is your Series A financing 5 million? Is it 10 million? There's a big difference there. What I have found from experience, no matter how big or how small it is, somehow companies manage to last right for 17.5 months with that month. There's something magical about that 18-month mark, but more on product, less on sales. And then as the product toward if there is an 18-month window of capital that you have gotten, probably somewhere in that middle, in the 9-month mark, and again, these are very general guidelines, you're probably adding to your sales team and to your marketing team. And then as you raise your Series B, it's all about scale. So press on the gas and hire salespeople and fire them even faster than you hired them. And we can talk about that at some other point. If this is going to sound really bad, but if you have a funny feeling in your stomach that someone is not right, that person is not right. I'm digressing, but the most dangerous people are what I call the B players, because they're good enough, they're just not stellar. The F players, you feel bad, but you fire them, you just know. The A players, they more than justify themselves and your existence. The in-between players are a problem. So especially when it comes to sales. And you've got to be meticulous in that regard also, because to tie it back to your business model, depending on your sales cycle, if you have a 1-month sales cycle, the guy or gal was hired, 30 days to kind of figure out the lay of the land, another 30 days to start making their first pitches. By the day 60, they should start being productive, is the terminology. And if you see that month 3, they're not being productive, you may or may not give them time and they're gone. They eat what they kill. Their existence depends on that. If you have a 9-month sales cycle, it's really hard to tell because it takes 9 months to sell $1 million installation, for example. In that case, you need to have many, many, many milestones of tracking progress, and it requires an amazing salesperson. I think your head of sales and your technologists, whether it's your VP of engineering or your CTO, are critical. But back to your question, after the Series B, it's about scale. So investing in sales, investing in marketing, so you do some real evangelizing. I think people often make a mistake of delaying that portion, and marketing is severely, severely undervalued, and I think that's dangerous. Marketing should be your lead gen, so it is the beginning of your sales. And then if you get to a Series C, it's again about expanding multiple offices. It's about oftentimes a head of partnerships, head of biz dev, starting to do your corp dev type stuff. It's all about land grabbing, and then either an exit, an acquisition, or hopefully an IPO. Did I answer your question? Okay. Go ahead, and then we should probably swap. Go ahead, please.
You mentioned that he should possibly introduce a light version of this product. Wouldn't that affect the credibility in this case of this product? Because he's basically going to be the first one on the block with anything like this, so he potentially could set the standard at this point.
So the devil is always in the details, right? So I called it a light product to convey the notion that it will not have the full functionality that all the lobbyists will get. He could call it a social product or a non-for-profit product. He could give it some other name and make it more tailored. What I was trying to convey is avoid the mistake, in my opinion, the mistake of offering the same product with the same functionality and having one entity pay $50,000 for it and one entity pay $500. And I'm drawing from a real life example. I have one portfolio company that prior to my investing, I loved the technology, but literally they had customers who for the same product were paying $50,000 a year and $500 a year. And that's just some major messing up, not to use any profanity. So think through that. And these were smart people who made those mistakes. And the reason they made those mistakes is because it's a land grab oftentimes. So your biggest barrier to entry becomes your execution. And so go at all costs. And you noted that, right? You said, we don't want to give it away to the big guys for $4,800, the product for $4,800. So how do we think of that? And I actually didn't address that. One way to think about that is to give them an early bird pricing or first adopter pricing, because they are taking a risk. They're king-making you if they're the biggest or the second biggest firm. And by the way, you're often better off going after the second biggest firm because they have a chip on their shoulder about being the second. But to give them a competitive advantage, you make it plenty clear in your contract. You're getting this pricing this year, and next year is going to move to X, Y, Z, and you're getting it. It's a one-time deal because you're betting on us, and that's another way to kind of mitigate the conflict. Okay, lovely. Was this helpful? My pleasure. Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to repeat this for a different business and see how it goes. Yeah. So your name and what the company does.
Awesome. So I'm Lindsay Hyde. I'm a recent graduate from HBS. I just graduated in May, and I'm the founder of BorkStop, which is a chain of dog daycares that are offered as an amenity in luxury urban apartment and condo buildings.
Well, Okay, say that again.
I'll say it more slowly. Dog daycare. And we go in as an amenity. So we're brought in by the building owner to be offered to the residents of luxury apartment and condo buildings in urban environments.
So what I heard is, for the purposes of this discussion, it's a B2B for C play.
Yes.
So you sell into a business, but the ultimate beneficiary is the consumer.
Is the consumer, exactly.
Got it. Okay. And how far along are you, and how are you thinking about monetizing it?
Yeah. So we're very early. We're in the process of partnering with Boston area developers to secure some letters of intent on their buildings. Boston, as many of you have probably seen the cranes downtown, we're seeing a lot of luxury buildings come online. So it's a good time to be working in the urban luxury space. And in terms of pricing, so the way that amenities work that we're finding with developers is they come in and they offer it to us for either free or reduced rent on the space. What is really nice about a dog daycare offering is that we can go into basement spaces. And so we can take what developers typically have as unused space and turn it into a really exciting asset for them. And then in terms of the cost, the customer, so the residents actually pay for the service. So it's a $40 a day offering. We're planning to offer it as a subscription service, just like childcare. So you'll come in and you'll either have a full-time option, which will be $800 a month, or a half-time option.
And so let's walk through the life cycle of the business. So step one, you get these LOIs going and this partnership going. Step two, who is selling to the ultimate occupant of the building? Is it the landlord saying, hey, and one of the services I offer is blah, blah, blah?
It is.
Or is it you? Okay. So that's good, because what it does, that's good and bad. It's good because what it does is it takes the onus of you trying to identify, you the random company, until you're the care.com of whatever, of animals, don't have the credibility to go into a stranger's home and say, hey, please entrust me with your pet. By the same token, it also means that your sales process has been entrusted to a third party whose day job is not your business. So how do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah. So what we're finding about pets in these apartment buildings is that because so many people are wanting to bring their pets into urban environments, is that property developers are really getting out and selling pet amenities as differentiators. And so they're viewing this as a way to say, come and choose my pet-friendly building with this great amenity as one way of selling the building as a whole.
Okay. So have you run the unit economics on this? Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or do you want me to kind of lead you through it?
Lead me through it. That would be great.
Okay. So $800 is what the consumer sees on their bill.
Yep.
What's the rev split between you guys and the landlord?
So we come in, like I said, as an amenity, and so the space for us is typically free.
Right. But no, I mean, they're paying $800 to the landlord. What portion are you collecting?
They are actually paying it to us. So we're doing all the billing, the full amount.
Interesting.
Property, and I'll tell you, I know the property developers are telling us that this is how the economics work for these types of businesses, and so we're, as we're going out,
give it a couple of years. Right. Let's see how the recession changes that.
Yeah.
So I would run the numbers. The other thing, okay, so you've started this business. It has to be no business is recession-proof, but you have to think about the good times and the bad times.
And the bad, right.
The other piece to think about here is how big is this market, and how are you going to monetize it? So by unit economics, what I mean is, in a building with X amount of units, X percentage of the occupants have pets. Of those X percent are dogs, because you're specializing in dogs, right?
Dogs, right.
And for those, on average, we can charge for this radius this much. If we expand, we'd have to bring the price, and we can't price differentiate, or you can, I don't know. So it's going to come down to the lowest common denominator. Do those multiplications. What's your market opportunity? How big can you get?
Yeah. So,
by the way, did that make sense, what I just went through? Okay.
Yeah, so we're seeing on a per site basis, we're modeling it at 4,000 square feet. And the limiting factor for us there is you have to have a certain number of square footage per dog, right, to be able to kind of meet all the right compliance standards. So for 4,000 square feet, we can serve about 45 dogs on any given day. Okay. So we're looking at top line revenue of, let's call it $500,000, because it makes the math easy from that.
But you're assuming full occupancy.
If we assume full occupancy.
Which you can't.
Right.
So what is the realistic number that you can assume on the occupancy side? Have you tested it?
So we're talking with daycares, which I think is the comparable. So Bright Horizons is the comp that we're using. They're saying for us to model at about 80% occupancy.
Wow.
So that, which seems to be comparable in the, like I said, in the daycare business. The reason we think that's right is because people don't have a lot of other options. Once they've signed up with you as a care provider, that's what their plan is for their dog. So if they're going to be gone for 12 hours a day, the other alternative is to find a different care option.
Right.
Right. So we're believing it's a highly sticky business.
But in that view, I think I think the stickiness is probably there, but the step that I think it's getting undervalued is your ability to actually acquire that business, because oftentimes, you're referring to the yuppies, let me just be blunt, who are working.
Right.
The folks who stay at home, yuppies or not, or elderly, that's their companion. They're not going to come to you unless they have an emergency, in which case they will be in the one-off category.
Right.
My hunch, and this is purely a hunch, not a business judgment, is you will see a lot more behavior that mirrors the daycares for where there is an emergency drop-in, like a lot of enterprises, a lot of companies have for their employees so many days a year, the emergency care one, then more than Bright Horizons, but remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Questions, thoughts, anything, or questions for me from you? Let's open it up.
Yeah. So one question that I had, and the reason I thought it would be really interesting to talk to you is we do have this capacity constraint, right? So we can only serve so many dogs on this square footage.
Right.
So one of the questions we've had is how else can we monetize, right? What are some other ways we should be thinking about that space utilization other than revenue from subscriptions?
Well, I mean, there are certain things. Since you're taking a book out of daycare, take a book out of what children and parents. So I'm the mother of a 15-month-old who is breaking the bank like nobody's business. And if you look at how they target, especially first-time parents like myself, it's add-ons. So you could sell stuff. Mm-hmm. Toys, dog food, so there's a commerce piece. And the commerce piece, you can, now you've entered the direct-to-consumer, which is not gonna mirror your other sources of revenue, and will create some conflict. It is a very different model to go to your consumer, to go direct to consumers versus the B2B4C. So if you're gonna make that choice, make it very carefully, and you've got to think it through. But just off the cuff, some of the areas is more product, and the product can be physical product, whether it's food, whether it's luxury toys, if they're very much into their pets, whatever it may be. And you can do those in the honest company style, i.e. as a subscription, a bundle that you get every month to mirror the subscription behavior that you're driving with the other piece, or as one-off purchases. And then, of course, I've left out the obvious because I don't know much about animals. Can you also have cats? Can you have birds? Like, what animals go with what? Not my domain expertise, as you can tell, but that's another. If you have underutilization issues because you're constraining yourself to one species, I never thought I'd say that, but can you open it up to more species? That's the other piece in the two areas that I can think of right off the top of my head. And then if you really want to stretch it, but you've really exited your business, content, activities, getting socializing of owners with pets so they can play and all that. So again, you can emergency care for the evening. So because you're probably doing business hours, what happens if someone gets sick all of a sudden, back to the overnight emergency, et cetera, et cetera. What we often do in venture also is, if we're nice enough, and I try very hard to be, we open up Rolodexes. There is someone that you can introduce her to. She used to be Leo, played Leo's function at the Rock Center, and she had a side business that was pet management and care. She's
awesome.
And I'm blanking on her name, but you know what I mean? I'll catch you up. But because this girl was doing it very successfully, and she quit this role to do that full time.
Awesome. Great.
Go ahead.
What percentage of your revenues do you anticipate would be from people going away for a week or two and wanting to keep their dog?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that we're modeling it right now is just on daycare. And the reason for that is because of how the permitting works. So the permitting for downtown is much easier on a daycare model than on a what's called a kenneling model, which is the overnight care. In the longer term, you could imagine us adding that boarding component, but right now we're not modeling that in. Go ahead. No, it is. We carry the liability insurance, so we're carrying $2 million of liability insurance that Travelers is underwriting for us. And the big place for us with liability is actually with our employees, because you've got to carry the appropriate workers' comp in case someone gets bitten or something like that. Yeah.
That's an interesting question, because I think you can never have enough insurance, but you also have to make the cost versus benefit of insurance. And especially when you are a new business, you don't want to overspend, but be very careful, get insurance, because if you don't, or if you don't have the right amount, your business can go under on one occurrence that had it taken place a year later, it would have been a non-event.
Yeah.
Especially if it's mission critical. Go ahead.
You're right now in downtown Boston, you said?
That's where we're targeting, is downtown Boston.
So you're thinking of expanding in the future, and where and how easy do you think it would be? It's a question.
Yeah. So I'd be curious to get your take on that too. One of the things that's exciting about working with property developers is that many of them develop multi-market. So the vision would be that we'd partner with one of the big luxury developers and then expand within the markets that they serve. It'll be major urban metros though, right? So probably the top 20 major urban metros in the US. We believe there's some potential for international as well, particularly in Europe. The pet care space is even bigger than it is in the US. So it's about $7 billion in the US annually, bigger than that in Europe. And so we think there's some potential there as well.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think, let me start with the last piece, which wasn't your question, but in Europe, though, you have an aging population, so it's a companion factor. So I bet you the ratio of the elderly with pets is disproportionately higher than in the US. So, there's one thing, and not that you're making that mistake, but oftentimes, especially when I see business plans and pitches, people will say, the market is 20 billion. Sure, the market may be 20 billion, but the addressable piece that you're solving is 500 million or 50 million. And at least as a VC, I'm not interested for a lifestyle business. Go right ahead. It's plenty big, probably. So, like you said, and forgive me for using this as an example, like Europe is much bigger. Sure, it's much bigger, but what's the piece that you are going to solve? What are the European, urban, concentrated, working, rushing people who just have to drop their pet for the daycare piece? It might not mirror the US market, right? But I do agree with you. It has to be highly dense, sort of high income and highly dense areas where there is a cultural association or interest in having pets.
Absolutely. Thank you. And what's interesting about the urban population with pets is it's growing. So about 60% of people 25 to 35 own pets. Wow. Yeah.
So maybe I should give in with my husband's request. Go ahead.
Hi, I had a question. So if your service is located in this facility or in this apartment complex, are your customers only people, tenants of that apartment, or could any other apartment people come to your office?
It's a great question. And in the amenities space, it's actually done both ways. So typically, if it's people within the building, that's where you get to not having to do this rev share. If it's people outside of the building, that's where you're starting to look at revenue share with the building owner. And the reason for that, right, is because you're using their property and plant to run your business.
And then there's the sanity or the reality check question. For people who own pets, that's a plus. But for people who don't own pets, do folks have an issue with having 45 dogs or whatever it is in their basement?
It's a great question. There was actually, there's data for everything, right? So there was a survey that was done by apartments.com about the value of pet owning buildings. So 2 interesting points. One is that property developers have said that it is now considered untenable to have non-pet friendly buildings because the demand is so strong. But even in buildings, even people who did not own pets, but who lived in pet friendly buildings, almost 80% of them said they felt like the environment was better for having pets around. So what we're finding is that even people who don't own pets, by choosing to live in a pet-friendly building, you're making a statement about your interest.
There's a difference between a pet-friendly building and a building where there are 45 dogs in a basement being cared for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and again, I don't know the answer, and if I knew the answers to all the business questions, I assure you I would have retired. But these are, when, let's say you were pitching me for money, right? When I think about it, that's one of the risks that I have to figure out. I don't know if I can get my head around it, but diligence, hey, is it the same thing to be in a pet-friendly environment versus to be in a building where there is a pet-caring business?
Yeah, yeah.
Any more questions? Go ahead.
What are you projecting the costs being of each one of these centers?
Yeah, so if we, say that it's 500,000 on top line, we're looking at what's falling to the bottom line of that being about 130,000. So we're looking at about 30% margin. Major cost to the business is the staffing, right? So, and that's a challenging piece of it because you're talking about hourly employees in potentially high turnover types of positions. And so the question is, how do you really create, in my opinion, I think the way to do this is to create a really sticky culture, so that we're using kind of the Starbucks model to say, how do we make these jobs that people are excited about and really feel passionate about, even though they're not particularly well paid?
And I think that's a critical point because I missed a fundamental question around this business. This is not a software business. This is not a build it once and apply it many times to scale. This is a services business. And services, especially when they're dependent on humans, scale as much as human scales, which is 24 hours in a day per human per da-da-da-da. So from that perspective, all of a sudden, she had the right focus, right? She's looking at the bottom line, the margin, because that ultimately it's about the profitability. It's about everywhere. It's about top line. But when you're in services businesses, you really got to look at the margin. And you know how you pose the question around scaling the business? If you're starting to do other products, or if you're offering content, other pieces that all of a sudden you develop once, you sell many times, then that margin starts to improve. And by the way, when you're in the early days, and again, I think this is probably a leftover from the 1990s, but in the early days, don't focus on profitability and starving your business. Focus on growing your business. But truly growing your business, losing money in perpetuity is not a justification for existence. But I think you're in the investment phase, whether you're bootstrapping it, whether you're doing seed money, whether you have venture money, whatever it may be. First focus is to start getting your proof points, then growing, executing and gaining market share. Ultimately, you start focusing on break-even and cash flows. And that's particularly true in the tech and software businesses. In services, like I said, you've got to be meticulous from day one. And if you notice, I started looking at unit economics and all that because it's the nature of the beast.
Yeah. Did we have another question?
You were speaking earlier about ancillary revenue. I wanted to know if you had thought about offering dog training. So I live in a Yuppie building in DC, and for those consultants that are not around a lot, they don't train their dogs particularly well, and so there's a lot of yipping during the day. So I was just imagining that could be something that would be of value to that particular market.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's totally spot on and a great utilization of the space, right? So the way that I've been thinking about it, which I'd be curious to get your take on, is, how do we take this square footage that we have, right? We're programming it with daycare 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., right? So then we've got a lot of time, potentially, both weekends and evenings, that we can program that space with. So what else are we doing in there to help generate that bottom line? I think dog training is definitely, part of that. There are probably other things as well. Grooming seems like a natural extension as well. Could we do a members-only dog park, for example, within there? I think there are some really interesting uses of the space that could be.
Yeah, and then you could really expand veterinarian services, on staff or emergency drops, and those could potentially actually become premium services. So they could be your $300 a drop type of service all of a sudden, where, back to your question on the margin, boy, does that look good.
Looks good. And to the point about yipping during the day, which I'm glad somebody brought up, this is actually one of the points of alignment with the property developers. So property developers are saying we have to be pet friendly, right? Because that's how we get tenancy. And we hate it because the dogs bark all day, they chew on the walls, they damage the apartments. And so by having an amenity like this, we're solving a problem that tenants like you have, which is like stop the dogs barking. But also we're reducing the overall damage in the apartments. And so that's one of the reasons the property developers are excited about it.
Good. Well, I'm sure you're all here because you have your own business idea. By the way, sir, I thought you had a question. Okay, lovely. Let's open it up to you, for your businesses and any questions that you may have around what you're considering, what's top of mind, and make it about anything. If you think I could answer it, I'll go for it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, so I'm Jason, this is Vasilios. We're running an online, it's not really SaaS because it's not software, but I'd say it's kind of subscription as a service where essentially employer branding for workplaces. So if you're thinking about where you might want to work, we help companies kind of showcase to somebody who's thinking about working there what it might be like. So using visuals, so think about photos, videos, getting sort of them inside from sort of behind a computer screen. And so companies are willing to pay, at least initially, we're really young, but we've had a couple of clients say, I want to pay, but I think the value of our service kind of becomes more valuable over time as we attract more job seekers to our website. So right now, we're focused in Boston. And so it's a small market. We don't have millions of unique visitors to the site, but we plan to over the years, right? So that value will increase the more eyeballs that are coming for an employer because more job seekers are seeing it. So I'm curious to get your take on how you think about, and maybe this is just simply kind of doing that early bird pricing you were talking about, but how do you think about pricing something like that, that essentially the more popular you get, the more visits you get, the more valuable that monthly fee becomes to an employer to pay you. Does that make sense?
So the way based on what you just said, the way I think about it is it's a marketplace or a network. So you're trying to drive a network effect, and you have your own, I'll use the term platform because it sounds better, platform with the next gen type profiles of employers. So using rich media is effectively to give an insights view. And so on the one hand, you have the employer, which is the paying source. On the other hand, you need the audience. So it's a little bit, and I had earlier during my EIR hours, I had someone else was talking about a marketplace. Marketplaces are very, very difficult to get instigated because it's not like a Instagram or a Tinder or something where it's hard enough to drive consumer traffic or downloads in my example, and in your case to drive traffic to the site. That piece is hard enough, and there are entire businesses that are doing that. You're now adding the complexity of also needing to acquire enterprises as part of the platform and getting them to be ultimately your customers. So to get the engine going is quite difficult. Once you get it going and you have sort of a virtual cycle, then it takes off. I don't think about pricing the way you're thinking about it. And again, you've given it a lot of thought, so forgive me for jumping the gun with 30 seconds. But the way I would think about it is the more people you get, the more critical mass, the more employers will want to purchase your product or buy your subscription. So because rather than focus on increasing the price of the 10 employers that you have on the site, focus at least initially on whatever critical mass and growth you're seeing on the job seeker side to drive from 10 to 50 employers. And then you can always add more capabilities to the site to drive higher pricing. Do you know what I mean? So go for land grab rather than extracting the maximum out of your existing or any given first early adopters. Go ahead.
Follow up, just a follow up.
Yeah.
So part of the challenge is we don't want to. It's like the penny gap, right? Like just getting them to even pay something is a challenge, and we don't want them to get too used to necessarily paying nothing, right? And all of a sudden we flip the switch when we maybe have hundreds of thousands or millions of users in year 2 or 3. How do you? That's kind of why we're and maybe that's the wrong way to think about it.
No, it's not. It's a very, very common challenge. And I have a strong bias against free trials because by virtue of calling it a trial, I don't know what it is about the mentality. Trials, they don't even turn them on. So think about who your constituent is. You're selling into the HR department. Now is it, markets have their cycles. It's a good time to sell into, there is, how Workday and a bunch of those companies 10 years ago disrupted the HR space. We're going through that cycle again. I see it in HR and I see it in sales enablement. So timing is right, willingness to pay, X amount is there. So check the box and check the box. But keep in mind that your overhead, you're selling into the overhead department of an enterprise. You're not revenue driving, right? So there are boundaries to that. I think don't do free trials, do pilots that automatically turn into subscriptions. Because there is this mentality, on the one hand, you want them to adopt the platform. On the other hand, you want to train them that they will eventually pay. So, but free trials, they don't turn on paid pilots or pilots that automatically turn into a 12-month contract carry a different meaning. So for example, you could say 3-month pilot, then unless you proactively cancel it, it's a 12-month, additional 12-month contract. All of a sudden you've gained a customer and a 15-month customer, not a 3, 12, or a 12-month customer. That's one possibility. Go ahead. That's great.
Yeah, well, if you take it one step further, and I mean, a lot of these online services or apps these days, they are pretty much free because otherwise people wouldn't even use them. What's your take on that in terms of if you're in that case almost purely relying on your size and then eventually maybe advertising, those sort of things from a VC perspective?
So very good question, and it gets to the crux of what I was hinting at the beginning of this chat on what we have seen in the consumer space. In this instance, in the example that was just given by Jason and Vasilis, right? The payer is not the consumer; it's still free to the consumer. They just have the challenge of acquiring the consumer, and that's no small feat. The money, whatever the willingness to pay, is coming from the enterprise. So they have kind of, at least in this first go, have an approach for how they're going to make money. In the consumer space, Facebook, Twitter, and the likes trained consumers, and even before then, the walled garden notions, right? Well before Google with the Yahoo and the AOL walled gardens, if we're old enough to remember all those. But we were trained that content on the web, digital, was generally free without subscriptions, but it was monetized with ad models. So if you look at Tinder, if you look at Pinterest, what I as a VC look at in that instance, if I am looking at a consumer deal, is the growth in customer acquisition or consumer acquisition. So there are a whole whack of metrics in that regard. So let's say it's an app, right? Number of downloads, active within those downloads. I will look at virality coefficients. I'll look at how much it gets shared. I'll look at usage. I mean, you get really, really meticulous and really deep in a different way in that instance. And oh, by the way, the bar keeps moving. If 3 or 4 years in this space, getting 100,000 downloads you were made, today that number looks more like a couple of million for a seed. I mean, it's because it has been, because the barriers to entry are so low. You and I can probably overnight, not even knowing how to code, probably could, I don't know if you know how to code, but I certainly don't. I took one class and did miserably. Abby, I need help. But we could probably start, launch an app. God help us, it would go nowhere. But nonetheless, so the barriers to entry are so low, so the bar for rising above the clutter is very high, and so those are some of the metrics. Then you worry about the business model later. Having said that, most of the time what that business model is, it's advertising supported. It could be rich media, it could be in the fashion of, I'm sure everyone goes to like CNN.com where you're forced to watch a video for 20 or 30 seconds. Display has been severely commoditized, but that still exists. Or you can have a ground-swelling sentiment from the point of view of consumers. I'm done with advertising and I'm done with all the tracking and all the cookies, because unless I'm unique, wherever I go, if I looked at this XYZ product, the display ads follow me because I've been dropping cookies on the step of the way, then all of a sudden you see Elo emerge. And for, maybe people have been hiding, but if you haven't been reading the news in the last couple of weeks, Elo is a new social network, and we thought we were done, that promises no advertising. They are trying to ride this wave and making the bet that they can do freemium. So you want to protect your data, dear consumer, and you don't want to be bugged by advertising, you have to pay. So they're trying to change 10 to 20 years of free mentality by riding this wave. Will it pan out? Who knows? Right now, it's very hot to get in, so we're all, following the herd mentality. But the major models are transaction for consumer, advertising supported, and freemiums. And freemiums are tricky. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, more or less. The only remaining question I have is, so from if what you said a little earlier, the VC would also come in possibly a little bit later, once you already have some of these downloads and not necessarily initially.
Not all VCs are created equal, right? So seed stage VCs are the first money that comes in and they take a bet. But my point was that because there are so many offerings out there, unless there's something amazingly disruptive, unique, and very evident from day one, you want to see traction. You always want to see a little bit of traction, even if it is just a few people to validate it, even for the seed guys. But when you see some points of validation, that target, my claim is, has moved, and it's moved higher and higher and higher because there's so much clutter. And it's hard to tell. It's much harder for me to tell today whether an app will succeed than it was 3 years ago by the sheer number of apps out there and the low barriers to entry. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you have a business that works both ways. You have a product that's B2B, but there's also a social network attached to it. So you could either sell it as a software, as some users would use it as a software, but there's a social network that surrounds it, so you could monetize it normal way through ads and stuff like that. What would you try to develop first? They gather clients through the B2B or users through the social network avenue?
Let me make sure I understand the question so I don't just give you a rambling answer. So the idea for this business would be that your business A, you're selling to business B, and there is a transaction that takes place in the form of either a license or a subscription. Yeah. But then you also think that you just want to go to market and sell that product on social networks, or you want to advertise on social networks?
No. Basically, so this is education based. Imagine that I sell to a university.
Okay.
So with the users that I gather at a university and the data generated with that, I can do a million things. One is what I'm selling, which is B2B, because I'm selling to the university, even though it's B2B for C because it's for the students. Mm-hmm. But with the data that I generate and with a whole lot of other things, I can build a social network around it. So I could monetize it that way. And other people that are not from the university and cannot use what I'm selling to the university can join the social network.
So let's assume, I'm going to give a crazy example, probably has nothing to do. Let's assume that you're offering virtual classrooms to the university. And so you're saying you're selling it to the university is using it for teaching, but then you're extracting a lot of data from what the students are, I'm making it up, saying, and you think you can build a whole social network around that. I don't know the right answer. A couple of thoughts, though, around it. One is, focus, especially in the early days, is critical. Almost singularity is better than multiple pieces. Founders often have big visions for what their business will grow into. And thank God for that, because if you were short-sighted, it'd be very incremental. But it's critical to take that big vision and parse it out so that you're singularly focused on succeeding in one piece before you extend. So my gut reaction is, let's stick with my example of the classroom, succeed in selling the universities and getting that adoption going. And once you've gotten critical mass that way, add that social networking piece, unless that social networking piece is critical to your core business, because the behavior is different. Go ahead. Oh, 5 minutes. So, and I was meeting with someone today, again, during my office hours, and she said, I can do this, that, and that. No. Focus. If you're going to do 10 things, you're going to fail. The odds as an entrepreneur, the entrepreneurs have a few experiences. One is the highs are high and the lows are really low. But secondly, you're ever optimists, and God bless you for that. Even in the darkest of hours, you have that, and that's why you do what you do. The third thing is you want to conquer the world, but the odds from day one are stacked against you. I don't care what business it is. And how you mitigate some of the odds being stacked against you and that risk is by being focused. Simple, focused.
Yeah. This is a question about the focus that you're talking about. So basically, what my friends and I we created is an event platform for college students looking for social events on and around campus. So we've seen that being a big problem. Finding things that happen, social events, so shows, concerts, parties, anything on your campus, and then different bar events or pub events. And then, so that's kind of the user base, right? So people going to the app, and we're developing a web platform to find these events. And then we allow local businesses to advertise to them, right?
Okay.
So restaurants and pubs. So, with that focus, should we be for, let's say, an angel investor, is it, or any, investor, is it important for us to, really get that user base first, or see, an increase in revenue from the local businesses?
Right. So, at scale, what you will have to have proven is that you are the app or the solution that your demographic college kids use for event discovery, period. By that, I mean you've got to really draw that audience. And then you've got to have a path to monetizing. And if that monetization is advertising from local guys, they're typically small businesses. So if I were evaluating your business, I would worry a little bit about the dependency on small businesses. And in fact, I would say, well, let's see what Foursquare has done in that regard. Or again, going back to the discussion with Alex around the analogy, right? To answer your question, so at scale, for an angel investor, you've got to show that you know how to get piece A and piece B. Then it's focus, where do you start? And I think you have to prove that the product you have solves the problem and you have users. Then, if the audience is there and you've succeeded, you can start to figure out how to monetize. Is advertising the right path? Is it local businesses the right advertisers, or is it something else? So show that you have thought about it to your angel or whoever you're pitching, but then, and that you need both pieces, because ultimately you need to make money, but you first have to have an audience to prove that you have a viable interest, a viable product, that you're selling a product for. Go ahead.
And I guess, so at what point, do you say, yes, we are the #1 solution, and how are you able to, what metrics, I guess?
When you arrive, trust me, you will know. But so, for example, Rap Genius, now it's called Genius.com. They do lyrics for music. They annotate lyrics for started with rap music. They had 1 million in the first few months, 10 million in the first year. I think they're in year 3. They have 30 million uniques. Believe me, they don't ask that question. They kind of know. But good rule of thumb, look at the growth, right? If you start with 10,000 people, and then you're going to 50, then you're going to 200, oh, wow, you're on to something. And by going, I don't mean over the course of a few years. I mean over the course of a couple of 2, 3, 4, 5 months, which goes back to when you and I have had one discussion, but intense one around marketing. Marketing in your case is your business. Exhaust all the channels to drive traffic, to drive engagement, to drive repeatability, to drive virality. And it's a science as much as an art, and do not underestimate it. Right? I'll take one more question and then we're done. Go ahead.
So this is a little bit different from the other internet-based businesses. So I'm trying to found a company in life sciences, so in medical devices, and you said something that was very interesting, and I'm having a little bit of a struggle.
There's always a first time. Go ahead.
Which was, you said, don't focus on the profits or don't focus on the profit. Try to focus on the growth. If I understood that right. Now, for medical devices, growth is going to come after I finish my clinical trials and so on and forth. But I thought, for my investors,
the same scaffold that I'm going to use for medical devices, so the scaffold that regenerates tissues, can I use that same scaffold early on as a life science reagent product before I get to all my medical to the clinical trials, and sell it as a reagent product for laboratory scientists to use it, so I can start getting some money in there in the first 1 or 2 years and not wait for 5 years?
Right. So I don't know much about life sciences and medical devices, so I've made my disclaimer. There are businesses, and what's interesting about medical devices is that you have a hardware component, then you have the clinical trials, then you have, if you have to be FDA approved, all that. So the life cycle is 10, 15 years. What I have seen as a bystander, it is not an area I invest in, is oftentimes companies get acquired before they generate $1 of revenue in your business. So kind of like very, very different, but kind of like I said, you know, Twitter and the consumer pieces, they oftentimes get acquired for Instagram, outlier or not. They still haven't figured out the business model, and then God did they get acquired. So think about the business model, but do not compromise your business or what your investors have backed, which is goal X, to get the medical device to do whatever you eloquently said, and I can't repeat, to the tissue, regenerate it. If that is the case, first of all, they're educated into the space, so they will know that this is not about generating revenues in year 1, 2, 3. My guess is they will look at your clinical trials, and there are milestones that they will track to evaluate your performance. If you find it necessary that you need to generate revenues along the way, be very, very, very careful about extracting that piece, almost running it as a separate P&L and not distracting you from the business that you have been funded or you've started and you're working on, because there's an opportunity, a fundamental opportunity cost, especially if it's a space where people are racing and the first guy is the guy that makes it out the door, and that's it, he or she their product becomes the default solution. Little money today may not necessarily justify the opportunity cost of the race or whatever. So don't be tempted by that. If there is a natural way where you can hire 2 people, they run it as a separate P&L, it's highly profitable, it throws cash that you reinvest here, it doesn't distract, I'm assuming you're the CEO, it doesn't distract from your daily activities of driving the business forward, by all means. But oftentimes that's not the case. Okay, Abby.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.